We welcome all those that might be looking online, and we appreciate your attendance this morning. We'll be studying from the book of Genesis today, and we're still talking about injustice and justice, and today the title is Injustice and Hope. Interesting scripture. If you keep that title in mind as we go through this, those two words will play an important part in thinking about the scripture together. It's, of course, very familiar scripture. As you will see, we're in the 21st chapter of Genesis. Our printed text today will start at verse 8 in Genesis chapter 21. Again, it'll be very familiar scripture to you as you look at that scripture, and interesting as the way we'll look again, keeping in mind injustice and hope. Of course, this scripture today is coming out of the latter part of the book of Genesis. The commentary points out that this part of Genesis, actually starting back in chapter 11, is really almost a personal history, if you will, focusing on the descendants of Abraham down through Isaac, Jacob, and then, of course, all of the 12 sons. The commentary tells us that Abraham actually entered the land of Canaan when he was 75 years old, and he received this promise, or this land that had been promised or planned for Abraham and his descendants. We know, of course, as we've studied the rest of the Old Testament, that this land is very, very important to the nation Israel, and there was many ups and downs and trials and even exile from this area. But today's lesson, we're focusing on the early part where Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, and the interesting family dynamics that were going on at this particular time. The point, if you didn't read this biblically, but you just picked this up and read about it, you would almost think it might be on a movie that we had seen on TV here or something. I mean, there's all kinds of things going on here with, of course, the historical perspective of how relationships and the slaves and those kind of things are sometimes hard for us to grasp in the way that we understand things and how things were in that particular time. But today we look at the history of the promise, of course, because we're talking about the line in which Jesus came out of. We're talking about the promise of the Messiah. And all of this lines up, but there's a lot of things going on around it. Sometimes, just like with us, sometimes when we get out in front of God or we don't think about God's plan, there are consequences. And we see, of course, today that Abraham and Sarah they tried to get out in front of God. There was a promise made about a coming child, but God's timing is different from our timing, and we know that we, like Rodney encourages this morning, we struggle with patience. We struggle for sure, and those consequences show up in the scriptures that we look at today, and there are harsh decisions made in today's scripture to the point of we wonder as we look at it. We question things here, but we know the history and the fact that there was a promised son, and Sarah thought that because she couldn't bear a child, then the idea was to have a son through her servant, Hagar. And we know, of course, a son was born to Hagar, and that son was Ishmael. But that wasn't what God's plan intended. That wasn't what his plan was. And we know that because of the relationship there, all of a sudden, Sarah and Hagar's relationship had changed. There was jealousy that was going on among them here before our printed text today, because Hagar had the son. Sarah at that point was barren, couldn't have a child. And so At one point, we read that Hagar even was looking down on Sarah, maybe even sort of making fun of her back in chapter 16. And then all of a sudden, Sarah started mistreating Hagar terribly in relationship there. So all of these things are taking place as a backdrop to what was really going on, which was God's plan to bring about the Messiah. And as the commentary ends in the lesson context, it says, all of this was ripe for more conflict. We can only imagine, if we think about the relationships that were going on here and trying to put our place in the character of different places, you'd wonder what were people thinking. Hindsight's always 20/20 though. It's always that way. Our printed text starts with chapter 21, verse 8. The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham gave a great feast. So now Sarah indeed did conceive. Isaac was born. The commentary talks about the timing of this weaning of a child in that day. The child could have been as much as 3 or 4 years old. We don't really know his actual age, but it would have been somewhere in that age when he would have been weaned, and Abraham is throwing a feast. Well, you got to remember all this backdrop now. You've got Sarah and Ishmael, you've got Hagar, you got all this going on, and Abraham is celebrating his son Isaac. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. The term here, mocking, of course, has a certain meaning to us today, but the commentary points out that there's actually several different possible meanings in the translation. The Hebrew word is something similar to what might be called laughter, make amusement, making fun of. But then there's some other deeper, darker possibilities according to the commentary. They point to the fact that same word was used in relationship to when the Israelites made the golden calf and all the dancing and all of the activities that were going on. If you remember that scripture, basically almost idolatry, if you will, in relationship. It also describes even intimate relationships between a man and a woman and activities there that, of course, are allowed within marriage, but inappropriate, touching otherwise. I mean, a darker meaning here in the translation. The commentary, of course, points out that because Sarah was already so sensitive to Hagar and Ishmael and all the things around them, he might have been, Ishmael might have just been teasing. There would have probably been 14 years difference, according to the commentary, in their age. So Ishmael could have been as old as 17 in relation to Isaac, who was probably 3 or 4. So, there's all kinds of things that could have been going on with that kind of age difference in that household and how the household was set up. But for whatever reason or whatever the teasing, Sarah saw something, either real or perceived, take place. And of course it made her angry. And she immediately said, and she said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son." Can you even imagine her coming to Abraham? All this celebration going on, something took place between the two boys, and now she's flew hot. She's mad. And she said, "Get rid of that slave woman." Of course, knowing all the background, it was her idea to begin with, that Hagar provide opportunity for Abraham to have a son. But that's all changed now. She has a son. His name is Isaac. And She wants no part of this slave girl and her son. For that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. That boy has no part. No part. Get rid of him. Get rid of him. Again, for us today, it's somewhat hard to fathom, but then on the other hand, you probably can sit and think of some family relationships where we've seen certain similar circumstances, where folks are split apart because of inheritance situations or because of a child that might have been born before marriage or out of marriage, all kinds of circumstances. Well, you see, that drama was already taking place. It's not new today. Right here in the scriptures, we see it play out in front of us where Sarah says those folks have got to go. He can't be here. He can't have any part of the inheritance. All of this in the backdrop of the fact that God had promised them a son. We also remember that Sarah laughed about that, So we see here, got to get rid of him. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. We can only assume, of course, that Abraham had a good relationship with his son Ishmael, that he loved his son. It was his son, that he had grown up there in his household. He had seen him grow from infant to now 17 years old. We all children, and we know what that is all about, how instantly that love bond is established. And we can, again, express the fact that Abraham loved his son. He wouldn't want to send him away like we all want to see our children grow up and be successful and have families of their own. Well, Abraham would have been no difference. But he's distressed, of course, because Sarah is really upset. Really upset. But God said unto him, do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Wow. What's God saying here? That doesn't sound like the God that I think about. He says, you go ahead and listen to Sarah, because it's through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned, will be reconciled. But what about Ishmael? What about Hagar? The commentary points out that God has purpose will, perspective will, and permissive will. In this situation, we see that God is permissive in his will, that the human decision or the human desire, i.e. Sarah getting rid of these, and God's permission about what's going to take place are going to line up. Because God's got a plan, we'll see as we read on, for both Isaac and Ishmael. But for us reading, it's hard sometimes for us to understand. You think Sarah's being very harsh, going to send these folks out, send them away from the camp. We all know the history of how things were at that particular time. If a husband died or in a slave situation, there wasn't a master or a household, then they were going to be destitute. Had no one to care. They couldn't own property. They couldn't care for themselves. And she was saying to send them away. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. Even though Ishmael was a result of not God's plan, but man's plan, God is going to honor Abraham. And because he's honoring Abraham, he says that he will make the son of the slave into a nation also. Because God is a loving God, a gracious God. He knows the plan to bring about the Messiah, but he also honors Abraham and Abraham's faith. Sometimes, though small, he honors it, just as he honors ours and offers grace when we get ahead of him. We get ahead. We don't have patience. We get ahead of God in that. Sometimes we try to do things in our own way before we even call on God because now we've messed it up. We get ahead of ourselves. I get ahead of him. But at this point, we see that he's promising to Abraham the protection for his son Ishmael. The commentary points out that after Sarah died, Abraham had additional sons, more sons. But none of those sons, including Ishmael, received the blessing that went through Isaac. He had additional sons, but they also, it does say that he sent them away from Isaac's family with gifts before he died. You see that in chapter 25 of Genesis. So there was a plan, and God's plan was going to move forward. But in this verse and the verse before, God tells Abraham to go ahead, send them out, but I'm going to make a nation out of Ishmael as well. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulder and then sent her off with the boy. Wow. Sort of hard for us to think about. A woman and a teenager sent off. And she went her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. It says that Beersheba was in the southern part of Canaan. And of course, this whole area was part of the promised land that had been set apart to Abraham. It also points out that it's interesting that they're going to wander in the desert like Israel's own experience later on. Israel wandered in the desert for 40 years. But they've sent on their way. She's out in the desert. Again, it's sort of hard for us to fathom, but he sent them off, trusting God. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away. For she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And she sat there and began to sob. So they've run out of supplies in the desert, don't have any water. Again, we're assuming this young man's about 17 years old, but evidently they've come to the point where they're just about to thirst to death, starvation. So it says that she tells the boy to get under the bush in some shade, but because she can't bear to watch him die, she goes off a little ways away, and she begins to cry. We, as parents, we can't even imagine what she's going through. But in verse 17, God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. Wow. Hagar had already run away one time before when she was pregnant, before she gave birth, and God had spoken to her then. But now we see that here they are in the desert. She's down to her last straw. She has nothing. She's trying to get away from her boy who is crying, I guess, because of hunger. And she's trying to stay away and trying not to hear that. And now God heard the boy crying and sent the angel to Hagar and said, What's the matter? God has heard the boy crying, and he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. The angel of God has heard the cry of Ishmael. God remembers his promise to Abraham about making a nation out of this son as well. And so he says, lift the boy up, take him by the hand. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. You know, we can't even imagine whether the well was right there and for some reason she couldn't see it, or God made the well appear. We don't know. Miraculously, these two were saved and spared. We don't know how that happens. It's beyond our human understanding. But when she listened to the angel of the Lord, she got the boy, and a well was there. She was able to draw water, life-giving water. She gave it to the boy. He was able to drink. God was with the boy as he grew up, and he lived in the desert and became an archer. Interesting how we see the words here. She went off and sat down about a bow shot away, and then he became known as a skilled archer. Of course,